A or? Okay. Good work, Jackie. Is that you remembering?
I've got several Post-it notes to remind me. So.
Great. All right. So as a group, do you want to start with A or with D? Any votes?
Well, let's start with D. It seems a little bit more manageable. Get success, and then we can tackle the hard stuff.
Okay, great. So let's see. Let me, I can share my screen so that we can look through these. Okay, so here we are on D, the affordable housing incentives. Okay, so first one has to do with these multifamily tax exemptions. And since counties are not currently eligible, the strategy is really, expanding advocacy efforts at the state level to make counties eligible. And then within that, considering using this voluntary inclusionary zoning. So group thoughts about whether this is promising, is a priority, could be modified, or should be deprioritized.
I think there's an important change that needs to be made, because this reads targeting the 50 to 80% AMI range, which would imply forget about those under 50%. I would just say it's either up to 50%, we decide, or it's up to 80%. I think we agreed that above 80% is an economic development tool.
Okay. Great.
And since this is not something that the county can implement at the moment, and things take forever to change, I would say it's definitely something that we should show on the end statement for advocacy. Get it in there early, say it often, but we can't hang our hat on outcomes for any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. My understanding is that the county's been working on it, so I don't think we want to ignore it or brush it under the rug. I'd like to keep it in the forefront so that we keep a push for it. This is a pretty big deal if you're developing as a for-profit entity. This can be a fairly big deal to get for-profit entities to do affordable housing.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so maybe we need a little bit more information about the efforts to date and thinking about how to build on those.
Yeah, John Blum seems to know quite a bit about it. I think he's usually on the group, but not here today.
Okay, great. We will follow up there. All right, any other refinements to category D1? Okay, well, let's move into density bonuses for affordable housing. And so there's, a couple pieces here, providing a density bonus, reducing the minimum lot sizes. And then there's another piece, that comes straight from the RCWs about giving some bonus density for affordable housing on religious organizations. So we'll need to make that change to, I think, D 2.3, we need to make the change for compliance. But how do the other pieces sound to you all in terms of priorities and revisions, additions, amplifications, and or revisions? Did I already say that?
Is there any sense of how these would be, like the political support for these type of changes? Are people going to get upset by them?
I don't have that information yet, but Jackie, do you have any thoughts about, maybe whether this topic has been discussed previously or what kind of reception these issues have gotten in the past?
I do not have any background on this conversation. I don't know if Ron as being around in a lot of conversations in the past with the county councils or boards, or any of our nonprofit developers might have more insight.
So in the past, a lot of these things come down to the individual project and how much density are we really talking about giving as a bonus. I think in a lot of aspects, many projects would have been eligible for a couple of units additional, but not talking about dozens and dozens. So I think I appreciate the thought process about this, but the context of density bonus and affordability, I think we have to be much more refined on what that terminology is going to mean for us under these circumstances. And then we'll know whether there's political ramifications or not.
So I agree with that, Ron, that we need to give it more thought. I'll just by way of example, and I'm not advocating for it one way or another. I mean, density bonuses are nice. I don't know how often they'll get used, but there may be situations where, to get back to the issue with, does the maximum density get used in the county when we've got, R43, and it's very difficult to develop without the commensurate parking. There have been a couple of times when I know I, as a nonprofit, but also for-profit developers, have run into a situation where we couldn't put enough. Had we been able to put more units, we could have paid for the parking podiums, 2-story parking with apartments above. And maybe in the case of a for-profit developer, you can say, we can, for you to be able to make your parking affordable or to give you some sort of concession on how the parking goes on the site, we'll give you a density bonus. And in some instances, the extra units can actually allow them to pencil out parking requirements. But those are very narrow. They're kind of like what Ron was saying. So it's a case-by-case basis oftentimes.
So I'd like to kind of build off of what Sirk said there. Maybe what we really need to be looking at is developing a couple of scenarios where we think that we could apply this so people can actually wrap their heads around it. So in the case of density bonus, putting it in the Highway 99 area, reducing the parking where there's transit to take its place, we might be able to then talk about the aspect of getting closer to a density number that we want. So if the 43 unit maximum is achievable, but they had to reduce parking or something of that nature, we're providing the amenity necessary, which is a transit corridor to go along with it. I think we have an opportunity to explain ourselves thoroughly enough that people can actually see what it is, and it's not just the waiving of rules for the sake of density. I think that's going to be the enemy of a lot of our discussion here, is if we're not able to actually paint a picture that people can envision that makes sense to both sides of the equation, it's going to be a lot more difficult. But I do think from what was said, I think we could actually come up with a couple of project proposals. If I go back and look at the tour that we took to the Elwood and talked about the idea of how that took place and on the land that was there and what they had to do and where could we apply similar scenarios and cut those density bonus breaks for the affordable housing. We might come up with a few scenarios that we could actually show the public, show the elected officials, and say, this is how we're hoping that it manifests itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think underlying some of this discussion about what's feasible and what can be built and when we get to A, right, if we're talking about increasing density for all development, then a density bonus for certain types of development becomes less useful, right? So part of this is going to be about how targeted the county wants to be with calibrating these densities, and whether it, a broader strategy or a narrow strategy is preferred.
So in some cases, a parking reduction automatically gives me a higher density because I can then put in more units without the concern for parking.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously you're not going to do that in the proverbial cornfield. You're going to do that along transit corridors.
Great. Yeah, we'll certainly be looking to that. I think that's category B, but yes, parking is definitely a key piece, but I think this is good conversation that density only matters in that context with parking. So that brings us right into D3, right? Alternative development standards for affordable housing. So looking at things like reducing parking, minimum parking where there's access to transit, allowing some eligible properties to be built in the commercial zones without that ground floor commercial, and possibly allowing these Highway 99 design guidelines to be departed from in exchange for, on specific affordable housing projects. So it sounds specifically like the first one could be a priority. Other thoughts in this group or about complementary strategies that could be added here?
So if I may, I'd like to address D 3.2, and then I'll keep my mouth shut so that other people have a chance to talk. But we were the pilot program for this in the city. We had talked about it, and it was a change that was hard to do until we had a live project and we could show what this would do. And so this relates to one of the a similar issue that's brought up in the A category, where it talks about putting housing in commercial zones. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how well people are going to go for that. And I would rather not change commercial zones. I would rather keep the commercial zones. I think with affordable housing, it's certainly defensible because you've got a way to put a bookend on it, to define it, whether that's 60% AMI or 80% AMI. Also, what happens in the marketplace is you're not going to put housing on, let's say, A-rated prime commercial space. That land is going to be too expensive, and it makes more sense to have that as commercial. Really what this does is it allows for affordable housing development on sort of second-rate or third-rate commercial land that really won't see development anytime in the near future, hasn't seen any development activity, even though stuff has gone around it. It's usually block in or off of either a commercial node or off of a main drag. And the reason that you don't want to change the zoning to, for instance, well, let's just spot zone it or upzone that lot to multifamily is limited to 43 units per acre. And oftentimes a commercial zone does not have a unit limit. And so it gives you some flexibility to then negotiate the parking and how many units you're going to put on it. And it actually ironically has fewer parameters than a housing zoning. So for me, I would I would like to make sure that this is a modification to the commercial code, not changing commercial zones to multifamily zones.
Yeah, those are some good nuances.
I was curious about the Highway 99 design strategy, and I may have misunderstood what he was saying, but I remember Victor talking about a specific development for affordable housing that had trouble. I thought it was in the Highway 99 design guideline area. Victor, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the project that we were working on, it just had some nuances about the number of entrances on the ground floor to make it feel more neighborhoodly, and it just didn't work for the type of development that we were doing, so we ended up having to cancel the project just because of all the sort of design requirements of like everyone needed a private patio, but there's specific research for senior design that if folks have that, then they actually self-isolate and don't interact with other people. So it was just sort of competing against the best practices for like different populations. So that was sort of the example I gave, I think, when we met last month.
Thank you.
Victor, there's also issues beyond, I mean, beyond your example. There's sometimes other design requirements that when you're trying to do affordable housing are fairly cost prohibitive, especially on corner lots and such, right? Can you speak to that moment?
Well, yeah, it was just the amount of, since the lot that we were looking at was a corner lot, so the amount of street and design improvements that we had to do on that much right away just made another added cost that just made the project non-feasible. So we split the lot, developed on one side of the lot that had the shorter stretch. And so, you know, for a market rate developer, they could make that pencil. But when we have limited resources, we can't increase the rents to make the design pencil.
Thanks. All right, so that sounds worthwhile to pursue in D 3.3. Okay, great. Let's talk about D4, some fee waivers for affordable housing. So there's some options here to waive, you know, I think this is meant to be up to an 80% impact fee reduction throughout the unincorporated county, and then reviewing all other impact fees. So, you know, I think what stands out to me certainly is, you know, this comes at a fairly high cost because the county's going to need to cover, you know, any waivers that it provides. So thoughts from the group about the priority for D4, how to employ this and or modify these strategies.
Well, I would just say if we're, as a county, is interested in affordable housing, this could be huge. I know that these impact fees and development costs like this really impact where housing goes, or even if it goes up.
Yeah, so are these worth keeping in?
I think they're worth keeping in, and I'd like to make sure that it isn't just, so the city has the 80% impact fee reduction for parks and transportation, which is nice and every little bit helps. It's not a huge number, ultimately, in the scheme of things, but every bit helps. I would like to, I mean, maybe we could add fire fees, sewer and water fees, and then I know that the one I really want that's going to be impossible unless we've got some great politicians are school impact fees.
What's a school impact fee? Like, what's that typically run, and what's that going towards?
It depends on whether you're, but for me, it's whether I'm in Vancouver or the Evergreen School District, but that runs for me into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's $15,000 to $25,000 per unit.
Yeah, Eric, they're used specifically to replace capital for building expenses. And there's a ratio that the school district puts out on the public share of that. So depending upon the school district's need to build based on potential population growth, the numbers can be really high. And they are, for the most part, really crucial towards adding to the school district's budget for the aspect of building buildings, because they can't be used for maintenance. They can't be used for ongoing expenses. They're specifically for replacement of capital structures.
Do we know, I know in some places you get a waiver if you're building senior housing or homeless special population housing from the schools. Is that a thing here?
I don't know, but we can certainly look into it.
Heidi, do you want to pipe in? You probably are the expert here as representing schools.
Yeah, so it, and I know the city of Vancouver's done this a couple times in terms of senior housing. Because if there aren't students created by your buildings, then there shouldn't be a school impact fee, and that we can work with. But if you are creating, if your development brings in new students, we have to put them in a building somewhere, and we have to pay for that building. And impact fees they actually end up being less than 10% of what the building costs, but they are a really important source for new buildings and expanding buildings for schools. And they're specific to the buildings. We don't use them for our general funds or anything else like that.
So Heidi, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to do that by accident. So I build housing for chronically homeless individuals who tend not to have children, or certainly not children with them. And we've approached the school district on a number of occasions with proof and numbers that we want to have kids living in our buildings. And we've been met very politely, and it makes a lot of sense that indeed we shouldn't be subject to those fees. But then we've been told that there isn't a mechanism for how those fees would need to be waived. And so first they would have to create a mechanism to then be able to waive the fee. And by that time, I'm out of the ground and leasing up.
Yeah, and I'm not an attorney, and so I may not be able to answer you, and I can hear your frustration and appreciate it, because I think, well, Marnie Allen would be able to know, and I think there's another attorney that's helping us out at this point that might be able to know that maybe I'll go back and get some information about what that would require exactly, and what we can do about it. Because I know that's coming up on, ADUs. There's a number of different kinds of housing that really doesn't create children for the school districts. And I don't know what that method would be, but we should investigate it. So why don't we could put that in for affordable housing for folks that don't add children to the school district. Let's see what we should investigate it.
And sorry to derail the conversation with that question, but it sounds like school impact fees are something that the county does not have control over. It's through the school districts.
So
outside the scope.
There is some control, but it basically, each school district calculates what new facilities they need depending on the number of students they project for enrollment. So we do a 20-year plan. Within that plan, the next 6 to 7 years is in our capital facilities plan update. And we say, all right, we're going to need a new elementary school, a new middle school, and a new high school. It's going to cost so much money. There's a formula that the county has implemented and has for the last, at least 20 years, that you just plug in the numbers to the formula. There's a multifamily component to it and a single family component to it. And you come up with a number, and it's right now the impact fees per unit varies from, so Vancouver school districts are probably the lowest. I think they're like $2,000 a unit to $2,500 a unit. And the highest are in multifamily, actually potentially in Evergreen and some of the other school districts, they're closer to $10,000 a unit. And so it is a big expense. So it is worth looking at, but it's specific to our capital facilities plan, and it's specific to the schools that need to be built to accommodate the growth.
Okay, so it looks like we could add a strategy there, pending some further information about, whether the school impact fees, whether the county could work with the school districts to think about a mechanism to exempt certain types of projects that don't add students. Does that capture some of the pieces we talked about?
Yeah, because it's statewide legislation, right, but we can see if there's specific.
Right, and I'm sorry, to Eric's point, it's a school district. It's not something the county can do other than its political will. So I don't know where you'd put that in this.
Right, I think that goes into the long-term timeline.
I couldn't forgo the opportunity to talk about it. Sorry.
It's okay, but actually the county does have some say. So and each city has some say. So the school district will come up with a number. Let's say I came up with, and I work for Camas School District. Let's say my calculations say it's $5,000 for a new house. I will go to, in Camas School District, I have to go to 3 different cities and the county. So in 4 jurisdictions, even though I'm all one district, I go to 4 different jurisdictions, and within each of those jurisdictions, I go to their council and say, this is what my school board has approved, please approve it. They do have the capability of saying, nope, we will only go this high. We don't agree with your school board. We think you guys are all wet. We're only gonna pay you $2,000.
Wish I could speak, period. I could answer this question about school impact fees and housing that is for elderly.
Is that Betty Sue Morris?
Oh, thank you for letting me speak. When I left the county council in 2008, it would have taken only a simple amendment to county code to allow an exemption for school impact fees for senior-only housing. The code may have changed since then, but from the county's perspective, that's all it would take. Now, you are correct that the school districts might object, but just from a strictly county perspective and procedural, it's just a simple amendment to county code.
And that's specific to older residents. It's not, I think Sarah's comment about other residents that might not have children, it doesn't address that.
Well, it could be limited. You can write it any way you want to, but the most limited method would simply be to senior-only house, that the exemption applies only to senior-only housing.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks for that background. And
if we do exemptions, I'm also thinking about people with developmental disabilities. They may have children, but it's very infrequent. So again, I know we're trying to come up with some housing options for them as well. And expense is a huge issue.
Okay, we can add that to the list to investigate. I do just want to point out we have about 10 minutes left, and we have one last in D and still A to get to, at least hit some highlights. So I think this great discussion around school impact fees and various jurisdictions, so well noted. So D5, any quick thoughts on these other ideas before we turn to zoning?
I just think you should have, yes, a staff person that's dedicated to affordable housing.
Thank you, Victor. All right, well, let's zoom up to A then. So, I guess we can try to go through these. I don't know that we're going to get through all 7 categories here. I think that one of the broader questions, right, that we were discussing with the whole group was, thinking, do we want to pursue some of these strategies by changing the standards in the existing zones, or do we want to either rezone or apply new zone districts? And so, we could either talk about that as a general approach, or we could go through these one by one. Thoughts?
What's the easiest?
I mean, we only have 10 minutes left, so I guess maybe we could just.
No, I mean, what's the easiest approach, to change existing code or change the zones? That's what I meant.
Oh, I got you. Code. Yeah, I think code is an easier fix. People, I don't know, for whether rightly or wrongly, people tend to react more strongly to this idea that their zone district is being changed, right? Rather than that the things that are permitted on their property through the existing zoning change, even if the actual outcome is identical, like,
So let's focus on that.
okay.
It's right along the lines of what I was saying with the commercial code.
Mm-hmm. So if we think about changing within some of the existing zones, are there priorities among some of these lot size reductions? And then the corresponding A3 increasing the maximum density to match those minimum lot sizes? Are there priorities within those?
But just looking at A1, I haven't examined them closely enough. Can we accept all of them? I mean, they don't conflict with each other, do they?
You can do A 1.1 through A 1.4. You could do A 1.5 also, but that's creating the new
A
zone.
new zone. So yeah, I would maybe stick with 1.1 through 1.4 then.
Mm-hmm.
I just like the idea of increasing options within the zones.
Mm-hmm. Right, you're using the tools that you already have.
What? And is there provision to allow duplexes and triplexes in all of the single family zones, or only the medium density and upwards?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. That is A5, right? And so some of the strategies that we came up with were, permitting those duplexes throughout all the R1, the low density zones, on the same size minimum lot as a single family detached. As written here, it's triplex and quadplex in the low and medium density zones. I think that'll be interesting to talk through whether, there's political support for all of these, but those are the options here. Townhouses, as written, this strategy would expand them into low density zones. And then the courtyard apartments and the medium density zones, the conversions. Yeah, so I'd say 5.1 through 5.5 are about expanding options, and then 5.6 and 5.7 are about limiting options, taking the cookies off the plate so that there's more broccoli that gets eaten, as I like to say.
Would that make a difference, do you think? I mean, again, yeah, it's hard to know the impact of something like that, the 5.6 and 5.7. If it's not
I was going to say, I think we know, but I mean, we've certainly seen the market patterns of what the market has provided, has
Right.
chosen to provide for the past 10, 20, 100 years, whatever. Is it too, I think the argument that you might hear back from developers, and if there's anyone that wants to, has more experience with this that wants to chime in, I think they would say, well, we're trying to find the most financially feasible use for the property. And if you just prohibit something, that doesn't magically make these other uses financially feasible. So you might get nothing as a result, right? If it's not feasible to develop a quadplex, no one's going to do it, even if they can't develop single family detached. I think the argument would be we try to do more units when we can, when we're going to, make more money on it. There's lots of pieces around like the market and the financing that does make it difficult to develop these alternatives. And so I don't know if the county wants to be quite so forceful in removing options or start with adding options.
Well, maybe it's a longer term priority then if the first ones don't work. Mm-hmm. Or I'm just thinking about could it be an option then for affordable housing? It might not be feasible for a for-profit developer, but maybe with the other incentives it might work for some of the affordable housing.
I think until we actually put some of these things in place and watch how the market reacts to them, we won't really know. We're going to be facing the aspect of a group of people that's making money doing one particular model right now. Their only complaint is there's not enough land and there's too many regulations. So we're going to have to offer some people creative opportunities and see who willingly steps up to the aspect of changing the way that they choose to do business as well. The missing middle will not solve itself if all of the duplexes and quadplexes end up being only things that are going to be rental units. We're going to just be creating different markets for people that are already in a situation of being able to afford the rent at the higher end. If we want to look at the aspect of the missing middle where we're actually creating some home ownership opportunities, we're going to have to get a little bit radical about what we're actually offering in the way of market choices. Because right now, I think we saw with the study, and it's pretty clear, there just isn't anything below a $400,000 threshold. So we need to offer small lots. Maybe we can handle that in the context of the minimum lot sizes being small enough. We have to be able to offer the aspect of people who are able to buy into some of that middle housing that was discussed at our previous meeting. And how we market that, I think, is somewhat in the case of this choice is realistic and there's an opportunity to actually have a profit margin on. So I would say we go with as many agreeable ways as possible before we end up doing the broccoli thought process, but there's gonna have to be some broccoli on the plate.
Add some broccoli, but maybe not take away the cookies just yet.
Yeah. Cookies first.
Eat dessert first. Life is short. You never know. Okay. Well, I think that could be an interesting way to frame this as, short and medium term, tiered strategies. Let's see, we have about 2 minutes. Maybe the last piece, we talked a little about these density incentives already. Maybe just come back to this commercial piece. We talked a little about this already, but this idea of, is there a desire to expand the residential uses in commercial zones? Is that, for all housing? Is it just for affordable housing or, age restricted senior housing? Or, I know that we heard perspective that rezoning to the R43, the high density, might be less desirable, in fact. So thoughts on this to help guide our priorities?
So my thought as an affordable housing developer is if you do it to all commercial zones for all housing income brackets, I lose the competitive advantage of going after second-rate land that nobody else wants. And I'm now competing with a market rate multifamily developer. And so you've just increased the land cost. Having said that, at some point, malls die, and replacing them with housing and mixed use might be a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I agree with what Sirk said, that I would just limit it to affordable housing. Maybe the whole thing doesn't need to be 100% affordable, but there needs to be an affordable, and I mean capital A affordable, not I'm claiming that it's affordable.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Sirk did bring up an interesting notion, though. There may be just some really large scale commercial sites that haven't worked for a long time, but they're too big to be tacked on to an affordable process. And we may need to be able to go back and look at those. But I'm still a big advocate of starting to say, what do we want the outcomes to look like? Let's measure that and see if we're getting the results that we want. So I would fall in line with make this an affordable category to start the process.
Okay. Well, I see that we are at time to wrap up in our breakout rooms. So I'm going to close this and kick us all back into the main room. So I'll see you all shortly. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully you got through a lot of those strategies, maybe not through them all, through all of them if you're like our group, but we did a good job at getting through most of them. We want to take a few moments to report back, and maybe let's start with Jenna. If you could, I'm going to leave it up to you. We have 5 to 10 minutes on the agenda for this. I'll let you decide, take maybe 2 to 3 minutes to hit what you think were some of the highlights or key comments we heard from our group, although it would be impossible to summarize the whole discussion because it was very rich.
Sure, I'll do my best. So our group started with the affordable housing incentive strategies. And so I think there's a lot of interest in a lot of them. I think we identified pretty quickly, though, that like the multifamily tax exemption is a longer term out of direct control type strategy. So the other ones seem to be higher priority. Let's see. Yeah, I think a lot of discussion on the rest of the topics in that bucket. And I guess a few things that are standing out to me, identifying that parking reductions is like a really controversial topic, but that I think overall the group wants to keep it on the list for now, but knows that can be challenging. Let's see, other things that stood out. I think the idea of providing a lot of options, but moving away from mandatory type strategies also came up. And at the very end, we started looking at the other, the expanding zoning options category. And but we didn't finish going through that. But a few things that came up out of that conversation, I think the idea of the R1 to 5 zone, that seemed appealing to the group, but figuring out where that should apply also seemed pretty important part of the equation with that type of strategy. And I think I'll stop there. Steve, feel free to chime in on anything else.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that there were only a handful of things that we thought should be taken off the table, but there were a lot of suggestions in terms of refinements and the need to dive in a little deeper and explore the specifics of how those strategies might be most effective, I think is fair. Let's go to Elizabeth and Jackie. Here are some of the highlights from your group discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We had a good discussion as well, and I'll just maybe hit on a few things that were the same or different. We also started with the affordable housing incentives, and let's see, what were the highlights of that? Just talking about the density bonuses, the importance that parking reductions are really a first step to make it even feasible to get towards using any bonus density. So that might be a short and a medium-term strategy. Maybe the need also for some specific site plans, either existing, recent development or hypothetical development, to see how those would interact. Looking at tied to commercial uses, that doing affordable housing as an outright permitted use in the commercial zones was seen as a priority, but not necessarily expanding to all residential uses in the commercial zones. Also some desire to see those Highway 99 design requirements changed for affordable housing. A lot of talk about the impact fees. We spent some time coming up with an additional strategy on waiving school impact fees for housing that doesn't add students, so like senior housing or people with developmental disabilities that don't have children. That maybe there could be a way to address that. And then as far as zoning, interesting, the approach that we talked about was to focus on amending the current zones in terms of the densities and the minimum lot size reductions, rather than introducing the R1 to 1.5 zone because of some of the difficulties around where would it go, and you know, hypothesizing that it might have a more limited impact, you know, just because it would only be whatever's applied as R1.25 rather than all of the existing zones. And then as far as adding the middle housing types, there was interest to expand the uses, but that it might be more of a medium or longer term use to restrict some of the uses, the single family detached and townhouses. So, you know, to use our metaphors, that maybe give the time to respond and develop a taste for broccoli before we take the cookies off the table. And yes, and also with the commercial, the idea that at this time, limiting it to affordable housing as an outright permitted use was the initial priority strategy.
Anything to add, Jackie?
No, I think Elizabeth got most. We did have, I think, on the affordable housing, just the multifamily tax exemption, even though it's a long term, it's still very important, and the importance to continue to advocate and push for that, and to make it more clear on our strategy, how we define it, that it says 50 to 80, but we don't want to forget those under 50. So is it up to 50 or up to 80? Clarifying that language.
Thanks. Hearing Elizabeth and Jackie, that reminded me, in addition to further calibrating some of these tools or the examples we've given, one of the things that was mentioned about strategy or category A was, you know, as we allow different, potentially would allow different housing types in these different zones, thinking about what happens when you're up against existing development or a different zone, you know, some sort of buffering along the edges to reduce the impacts on existing development was a concept that came up. I might not be articulating that perfectly, but I think that was the general idea. Well, thank you everyone for what I assume in both groups was a rich conversation. I'm going to share my screen again here. We're going to move to public comment and go through this, which I neglected to last time. If you'd like to speak, please click the hand raise icon. And if you can't find it, we'll figure out another way to get our attention. I know depending on what version of the software you have, it can work in different ways. I'll acknowledge you one by one. When you are acknowledged, you can unmute yourself or we'll unmute you. And you have about 2 minutes to share your comments. And then when you're done, please click on the lower hand icon. So I think I saw Kathy Neary. I think you clicked on an icon. Is that correct? You want to share some public comment? Please unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Hi there. I actually have 2 questions that I'd like to hear a response to. The first is, how do you measure the impact of different policy changes when you make a number of policy changes at once? So, and the second question is do we have access to data from other counties, cities, other urban growth areas that have implemented policy changes and that know what their impacts were? Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. To your first question, that's a really difficult one, and I don't know that I have an answer per se. As we begin to narrow these strategies and look at them not just individually, but as a package that we're going to recommend, we will definitely need to take a closer look at how they interact and how their impact is strengthened or weakened, you know, as a package as opposed to individually. So, and then when I'm done, Jackie, maybe you can chime in. Well, and the second question, I don't have an answer to that. I think we have lessons learned from other places, and we actually did some case studies. So we have some lessons learned, but I don't know that we have specific data on the impacts maybe within other jurisdictions in Washington. Jackie, do you want to add to either of those responses?
Well, same thing what you were going to say about what we've done so far, at least with the case studies on the second question. And that's posted on our website. Kathy, if you want to go check that out. I think it was the April or March, and it's also on the homepage under just the public meeting that we had on May 11th. For the policy, I know this group has talked a lot about making sure that we do come up. We want to know what the outcomes are going to be for whatever changes are made. So I think this group is going to talk more about that and figure out a way as to incorporate that. The county does have some analysis that we do when we're looking regarding land use and preparing for population growth in our comprehensive plans. I don't know if it gets to the nuance maybe that that the group is talking about now. So we're kind of open to that kind of conversation and how best we can measure that.
Thanks, Jackie.
Mhm.
Thank you for your question, Kathy. Does anyone else have any comments they'd like to make today before we move on to next steps? I know we have lots of folks lots of guests here today. I just don't want to miss anyone. I'm not seeing any raised hands. So I'm going to go ahead and move to our next steps. So here we are in this develop recommendations phase. We need to update the dates on this graphic. We'll do that before the next meeting. As I mentioned earlier, we're really going to be looking at, meeting with you through December and then moving on from there. In terms of immediate next steps, our next meeting, excuse me, is July 6th. And we will continue to talk about housing strategies. We'll look at some other categories. We'll send out a Word document or a PDF ahead of time with some more information on those categories. And then we'll do the same thing again in August. I anticipate that we will have even more time for discussion at upcoming meetings. Today, we had a few items that we had to go over in terms of the framework and timeline and things, but I anticipate that at these next two meetings, we really want to dedicate almost all the time to a little bit of time to presenting the strategies that we've developed, and then a lot of time to hearing from all of you about those strategies. And then just a reminder that this group will not be meeting in September. That's when we will try to take all we've heard from you, share it with the public and Planning Commission and County Council, and then come back to you in October with a refined and repackaged set of strategies to take a look at, and hopefully with a little more analysis as well. Any questions or comments before we wrap up for today? We're just about out of time. Jackie.
Yeah, before we leave, I know that we had one member of the public in our breakout room, and he was wanting to ask questions, and I just want to make sure he heard that we had that opportunity. Glenn, are you here? Because I just want to make sure you asked your question.
Yes, I am here. And actually, it wasn't so much a question, it was more a statement. When we were speaking about potentially rolling out, or working to get the state to roll out a version of the multifamily tax exemption, I just wanted to stress how critical it would be before we actually get that set up to make sure that the legislature understands and writes the language for the income levels. And because we're running into the problem in the city where the way the law is written, affordable is not really affordable. So I think it's just critical that if we do go that direction, that we make sure that they use an income level that's actually relative to Clark County versus the Portland metro area, which is what's happening in the city. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. And thanks for everyone who stuck with us throughout the course of the meeting. You'll see a similar format next time. So we appreciate people holding their comments and for the public comment period and listening in, because we do appreciate to hear what you have to say as well. And like I said, in September, if not sooner, we'll have more opportunities for public input. Julia, yes, I will extend the calendar invite through December, so everyone's got it in their calendars. Thanks for the reminder there. And with that, Jackie, anything to say before we close?
Nope. Thank you, everyone, and stay cool this weekend.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. I was hoping you would start with category A, Jackie.
Because
Elizabeth was in your group,
thing.
but I forgot
Yeah.
to say it. But since Elizabeth was in your group, I was like, oh, I hope they start with category A. It's no
Yeah.
problem though.
It was good
Okay.
discussion.
Yeah, we had a great discussion too.
Are we with the recording? I know you had said something about sticking around, making sure. the
Basically,
breakout room.
when you leave the meeting, it's possible. Like what will happen to me is I get a notification and it says, "Hey, we're converting your recording," and it takes a little while. So you just want to leave your computer on while it processes that.
Okay. Because I hit the recording button for our breakout room.
Yeah. So if you don't
but
see
I didn't get anything else. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
If you don't see anything when you exit out of this meeting, then you're fine. But my guess is it'll pop up and say, we're converting your recording,
Okay.
and it'll
Okay.
give you a little time bar.
Gotcha. Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't blow that one.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Thank
We'll
you.
talk soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.